So HTML, a hypertext markup language, is a way of structuring content or structuring data on the World Wide Web. An HTML document consists of elements, and elements consist of tags, generally followed by then some content and what's known as the closing tag or end tag. Here's an example of some HTML content. It starts with a start tag. It's the content itself, and then there's some end tag. So in this lesson, we'll start to look at HTML, and we'll look at the different types of tags and how they relate to what you see in the web browser. In the same way that HTTP is a plain text human readable protocol, HTML is a plain text human readable language. That means that you as a human can read HTML and see the content and see the data and the structure of that content. Now it's important to note that strictly speaking, HTML is a way of structuring the data but does not decide or determine how to display it. So HTML says, here is the content, here's how pieces of content relate to each other, but it doesn't say how to display it. It's up to the web browser to choose how to display that content. Here's an example of the hierarchical structure of HTML. We'll see what these tags actually mean in a little bit later in this lesson, but the point here is that the elements can be nested, that is, that one element can consist of other elements, which consist of other elements, and so on. For example, here this first element is just kind of floating there, this document type. But the next element, the HTML element, you can see has the start tag at the top here, and an end tag at the bottom here. And in between is the content. Now in that content, the HTML content, we see the head and the body elements. The head up here is going to be the header or information about the content, and then here the body is the content itself. So we can see that HTML consists of a head and a body. And then we can dig down deeper and see this nesting or this hierarchical structure even more. For instance, the head contains a title, which is the title of the page, and so on. So let's look at some of these important HTML tags and understand what they do, and then we'll see as we go along how you'll use them to create web pages. So the first one is the doc type. It's not actually a tag, but rather tells the browser what type of version of HTML the content is. Nowadays, HTML5 is the most popular type, and so we would use this tag here, doc type HTML. This declaration must be the first line of any HTML document because it tells the browser what type of version or standard of HTML it's using. After the doc type comes the HTML element. We can think of the HTML element as the root of our tree, if you will, of the structured content, the hierarchical content. In this case, we have doc type, and then what follows it has to be HTML. Everything else goes here, and then not HTML, or the HTML closing tag, the end of the HTML. As we saw a little while ago, HTML element consists of the head element and the body element. The head element is not actually the content of the document, but rather information about that document. For instance, it might include the title of the page. The title is what appears in the title bar at the top of your web browser. There might be a link to other files that are going to be used within this page. For instance, CSS, which is a way of formatting the content, which we'll see later in this part of the course. Meta tags are used to provide additional information about the content or about the web page. For instance, keywords that can be used by a search engine. And then lastly, if we want to have any dynamic content or dynamic behavior in our HTML page, we would use JavaScript. And the script tag allows us to link to JavaScript code that we'll see later in the course. I said that the HTML element consists of the head element and the body element. The body element includes all of the content to be displayed within the web browser. That might be images, it might be text, it might be links, etc. So how are HTML and HTTP related? In the previous lesson, we talked about HTTP as this protocol for requesting content and sending back a response with that content. So where does HTML fit in? So when a browser makes a request for some document or some content or some resource on the World Wide Web, it sends as part of the HTTP request the name of a file or some resource, in this case, hello.html. When the server handles that request and sends back a response, the contents of that file, the contents of that HTML file, are the response, or are part of the response, are the content, the body of the response. Then, when your browser gets back that plain text HTML, the structure of the content, the browser decides how to display it. And here I'm using Google Chrome to display that very simple HTML page that just says hello world. So for the rest of this course, if you want to follow along with what I'm doing and try these things on your own, I recommend that you use some sort of plain text editor. So we don't want to use any document editor that's going to introduce formatting, but something that just allows you to write plain text. Once you have that ready, you can create a new file. You can put your HTML in that file, for instance, the HTML that we saw in this lesson. Save the document, we'll call it hello.html, and then open that file using your web browser. Now I'm going to use Google Chrome in the rest of the course. You can use Google Chrome or you can use any browser and it will still show you render the HTML. Now one nice thing about all modern web browsers is that when you get the HTML content and it's displayed in the browser, you can actually see the HTML and in order to figure out like how do things work. So in this case, I have my hello world page that I'm looking at with Chrome. If I right-click or use the context menu, I can select View Page Source, and then that will open up the source of the HTML. So the browser is displaying that content, figuring out how to display it, but it's also allowing me to see the code, if you will, the HTML that's used to render that content. So this is just a taste of getting started with developing web pages and web applications, understanding HTML. In the next lesson, we'll start to see more about HTML, the different types of tags, and then we'll later in this part of the course look at how we can affect the appearance of the content in our HTML pages. In the previous lesson, we started to look at HTML, hypertext markup language. This is the way that we structure the content that we're going to display on the World Wide Web in a web browser. And we saw 4 important HTML tags, or the elements of an HTML page. The first one specifies the version of HTML. Then we have the root element of the entire document. And then one for the header of the document and one for the body of the content in the document. And using those 4 tags, we were able to create a simple little HTML page that looks like this. Now obviously we want to get to a point where we're seeing very interactive HTML pages with a lot of graphics and content and images and so on. But in this lesson, let's walk before we run, I suppose, and just get to changing the appearance of some of the content and having more structure to our content. So we'll start with one of the important HTML tags, which is the P tag, standing for paragraph. We can use the P tag or paragraph tag anywhere in the body of the HTML to delineate or separate different paragraphs or ideas or different parts of the content. So here's an HTML page or part of an HTML page. We still have our doc type element at the top. We have the head, the body, but within the body we can have paragraph tags, start and end tag, for our paragraph elements, and we can have many paragraph elements, of course, within the body. Now it's important to remember, and I've mentioned before, that HTML specifies the structure of the content, but not necessarily the way it will be displayed. HTML is plain text, but don't think that what you see in your text editor will necessarily translate exactly the same way when rendered in HTML. And here's an example of that. In this case, I have the words, "This is some text." I have a new line and a blank line here. Then it says, "This is some more text," a new line, and so on. And we might think, because we're used to using document editors that are what you see is what you get, that if we were to look at this in the web browser, it would look exactly like this. But actually in the web browser ignores the white space. It ignores the break. It ignores that blank line. And this would all appear as one line of text. So it's important to remember that HTML is being used for structuring the content, but not necessarily deciding how it will be rendered or displayed. In addition to the P tag, sometimes we want to indicate that the HTML is not just content, but rather some sort of section header. And in that case, we use the H tag with a number from 1 through 6, indicating what level or importance of that heading. So H1 is the most important. That would be, for instance, the title of the entire document. And then there's H2, H3, down to H6, which is a very low-level subheader. Now the browser determines how to render H1 and H2 and so on, but we would use this to tell the browser this is a section header and not just content. Here in this example, I'm using H1 tag here to indicate that this is the most important header, and then I would see down here my browser, which is Google Chrome, would render this in this particularly large, bold font. I can have a smaller subheader using the H3 tag, and Google Chrome will use it in a slightly larger than normal text, but also bold font. Now, I've been saying that HTML is used for structuring the content and not necessarily affecting its display, but sometimes we want to tell the browser, hey, this is important text or important content, and we would like you to render it in a way that's different from regular text. And two ways of doing that are using the B tag for bold and the I tag for italics. We could also use the strong tag, which is similar to the B tag. It will render in bold, but it just is to tell the browser that this is important semantically, more important in terms of meaning, and not simply show this in bold. Likewise, there's the EM tag for emphasize, I suppose, which also will tell the browser to render it in italics, but to emphasize this text. Previously, I showed the example where we had line breaks and empty lines in our HTML content, but the browser ignored that and rendered it all as one line. But if we want to tell the browser, please put a new line here, or put even a horizontal line here, we can use the HR and BR tags. The HR tag is to indicate that there's some serious shift in the content. We're separating different parts of the content, and that'll render a horizontal line. The BR tag would be a line break where we want to make sure that there's just some white space between the different parts of the content. So for example, here we see some HTML. Here's how it's rendered. The HR tag for horizontal rule, I suppose, is this horizontal line. The BR is just this extra blank space and extra line break. Two more tags to talk about that are somewhat related, but are going to be used later in the course when we're affecting the appearance of the content. One is the div tag. The div tag gives us some more structure within the body that says that this part of the content goes together. It's a way of organizing the content, and as we'll see later, it's a way of applying visual elements and styling and formatting to parts of the content. Related to the div tag is the span tag. The span tag says, here's some text, some content, that we were going to eventually apply some formatting or styling to. It's usually a smaller part of content than the div tag, which can be a much bigger part of the content. Last, within our HTML, we can also have comments. Comments are things that are not rendered in the browser, but are perhaps notes to ourselves or to other people who are viewing our HTML, or we can temporarily remove parts of the HTML. In this part, we're listing people's names, but this particular name here is commented out. It would not appear when it's rendered in the HTML browser. Now you may note that all of these HTML tags start with the less than symbol and with the greater than symbol. We noted also that when we had a line break or an entire blank line, that the browser ignored it. So how can we address these perhaps special characters? In HTML, we can insert special characters using the ampersand, then the particular name, and semicolon notation. For example, as we see here in the slide, ampersand NBSP for non-breaking space, followed by semicolon, puts in an extra white space. Ordinarily, the browser will take any amount of white space and condense it down to a single white space, single space between, for instance, words. But if we want more space or more space between paragraphs, we can use the NBSP tag. If we want to have a less than or greater than, we can use ampersand LT semicolon for less than character, ampersand GT semicolon for greater than character. Now, you might say, well, wait, we started this by saying that less than was a special thing, and so now we have a way of showing less than. But what about ampersand? Because now ampersand is something that's being used in a special way. So if we want to use ampersand, it's ampersand then AMP semicolon for the and sign. And there are lots of other HTML entities, special characters, copyright, registration, the euro character, the pound sterling character. We can insert any of these using the different HTML special entities. Last, here's a big HTML page with all of the things we've seen in this particular lesson. We start with the doc type element, which says what version of HTML we're using. We have the HTML element, which is the root of our structure. Within the HTML element, there's the head, which includes the title and, in this case, some meta information. The HTML element, in addition to containing the head element, contains the body element. The body element, in this case, has some headers, H1 and H3 headers. We see the paragraph tag, or the P tag, used to indicate here's some content that's separate from the rest of the content. Here's a horizontal rule that will give us this horizontal line in the content. We have the div tag, which is going to say, here's some chunk of content to which we may apply styling and formatting later. And we have the span tag, which is similar to the div tag, but is used for a smaller piece of content. When I look at this in Google Chrome, this is what I see. So far in the course, the past couple of lessons, we've seen HTML. HTML is a plain text, human readable language for indicating the structure of the content that we're seeing on the World Wide Web. And we've started to look at the different tags that we can use to organize that content. Coming up, we'll see more tags, but also start to look at how can we affect the appearance of the content in our web browsers. Here are the important HTML tags that we saw in the previous lesson. Using those HTML tags, we were able to create a web page that looks like this when viewed in Google Chrome. Now, for the most part, it's Google Chrome or any web browser that's deciding on the appearance of the content. We're giving some indication to the browser that this should be bold, this should be italics, but for the most part, the browser decides how things should appear. In this lesson, we'll start to talk about how we as the programmer, we as the developer of the HTML page, can tell the browser this is how we want this content to appear. We're going to do that using what's known as HTML attributes. Every HTML element or tag can have additional information provided as attributes, which come in name-value pairs. The name specifies some sort of property of the element, and then the value is the value of that property. In this example at the bottom of the slide, we have the P tag or paragraph tag, and we can specify some named attributes, and then it's equal to some value. The first attribute we'll look at is known as the title attribute. The title is not the title of the page, which we've seen previously, but rather the title of that element. And we would be able to see that title when we hover or mouse over that element, and we would see the tooltip, which gives the name. For instance, in this case, if I have a H1, a level 1 header, and I give it the title Welcome, when I mouse over or hover over that, I would see the tooltip that says Welcome. But for affecting the appearance, we're going to use the style attribute. The style attribute lets us, as the creator of the HTML page, tell the browser, this is how I want you to render, or this is how I want that HTML content to appear. And there are different key value pairs that we can use within the style attribute that specify the visual appearance of the content. As a very simple example, I have an H1 piece of content, which would in Google Chrome be rendered like this. It's a little bit bigger than normal text, and it's bold. But I can use the style attribute within the H1 tag to tell it I want the text, the content, to appear as red, and I also want it to be transformed so that the first letter of every word is capitalized. So you see here, I have the style attribute within the H1 tag, and I have this key value pair, color::red, which tells it I want the text to appear red. There's a semicolon because I'm about to give it another key value pair, which is text transform capitalize, which tells the browser transform this text, which is here, and rather than rendering it as it is in normal H1, capitalize the first letter of each word. And what we would see in Google Chrome is content that looks like this. It's still the same font size as H1 usually would be, but now it's red, and now the first letter of every word is capitalized. Some of the other properties of the style attribute that we can use include the background color. Ordinarily, a browser will choose some background color, usually white or maybe gray or something like that. But we can say we want the color to be yellow or red or whatever behind this particular text. We can specify the font that's used. The browser will generally choose some sort of font. But for instance, we may want a sans serif font like Verdana. We might want a fixed width font like Courier. And we tell the browser this is the font to use to show this text. We can choose the font size. The font size can be specified in the number of pixels high. It can be using some other measurement metric like inches. Or we can say what percentage should it be compared to what it ordinarily would be. If it's ordinarily 12-point font and we say 200%, then of course it would be rendered in 24-point font. And then if we want to shift the text, align the text, we can use the text align property of the style attribute to say whether it should be centered, left justified, right justified, etc. So here's an example where I'm using the span tag. In the span tag, I mentioned previously that we have a little bit of text, in this case the word world, to which we want to apply some formatting. In this case, we're going to apply the style attribute. We're going to say that the color of this text should be white. The background color should be green. We're going to use the Verdana font, which is a sans serif font. And we're going to make it twice as big as usual, font size of 200%. And in Google Chrome, this is how that would be rendered. Let's see another similar example and start to talk about some of the things that we would want to do as HTML developers or web developers, web programmers, to simplify this a little bit. In this particular case, I have a paragraph with the content 1 is an odd number, and then I have another paragraph with 2 is an even number. And you can see that I'm using the style attribute of that first paragraph to specify the color as blue. That's the color of the text. In the second paragraph, I'm using the style attribute to specify the color is white, and the background color is now blue. And in Google Chrome, it would look like this, with 1 as an odd number being blue on white background, and 2 as an even number being white on a blue background. Now, what if I want to add more paragraphs and alternate between blue on a white background for odd and white on a blue background for even? Well, I can copy and paste, and then I can change 2 to 4 and 1 to 3, and what I see is something like this. Now I'm using color blue for the odd number, and color white, background color blue for the even number. And now I can do this for 5 and 6 and so on and so forth. And sure, this all works totally fine. But what happens if I now want to change the color of the odd numbers to green? Well, I would have to go, and each of these places where I've specified blue, I would have to change that to green each place. Likewise, if I wanted to change the background color for the even numbers, for instance from blue to green, I would have to go and change that in every single place. And that sort of seems repetitive, and maybe there's a more graceful way where I would only have to change it in one place and not have to change it every single place. And so in that case, we're going to use two other important attributes of an HTML tag or element, which are ID and class. The ID attribute lets us give a unique identifier to that HTML element, that HTML tag within the HTML page, that we can then use to apply, for instance, formatting and appearance. Class is a collection of elements that can belong to a class that lets us say, apply this formatting or apply this appearance to all elements that are in this class. So the difference between ID and class is that ID is unique to a specific element in the HTML page. However, a class can include many elements, and an element can say, I'm in this particular class. So how would we do this for our even, odd, blue, white example? Well, rather than having every other paragraph, the odd paragraphs, specifying the color blue, I will put them into a class called odd. That is, the attribute is called class, and its value will be odd, which I've made up. Likewise, I will take my even paragraphs, and rather than having this long style attribute specification, I will put them into the even class. Now at this point, if I put the odd ones into the odd class and the even ones into the even class, and I tried to render the page would say, I'm sorry, I don't know what odd and even are, so I need to tell it what odd and even are, which I'm going to do in the header of my HTML, the head section of the HTML, using the style tag. So at the bottom, I have the body, and as you can see in the body, I have the odd paragraphs are in the odd class, the even paragraphs are in the even class. Within the head of the HTML page, I'm using the style tag. The style tag says that what's between the tags, what's in this element, is not HTML content to be rendered, but rather styling or formatting information about that HTML content. The first thing we see is this specification of the odd class should be the color blue. How do I know, or how did I specify that it's the odd class? Well, obviously it's the name odd here, but also the period before odd indicates that this is a class name. And we'll see examples later where it's either an element name or an ID name. In this case, dot odd or period odd says that I'm specifying the appearance of every element that is in the odd class, which are these odd paragraphs down here. Likewise, I have dot even. That says that this is specifying the appearance of elements that are in the even class, which are these ones down here, of course. And I'm saying that in the even class, the style of any element that's in the even class is to have the color white and the background color blue. Now, when the web browser renders this HTML, it'll apply the odd formatting to elements in the odd class and the even formatting to elements in the even class. Why did we do this? Well, it saved a little bit of HTML, but remember the motivation was, what if I want to change the color of the odd text from blue to green? In the previously, before we saw the style tag, we'd have to do that in 3 places. Now I only need to do it in 1 place. I only need to change it here, where if I want anything in the odd class to be green instead of blue, I just change it in 1 place. Likewise, if I want anything in the even class to have a green background instead of a blue background, I don't have to go find every even paragraph. I just have to change it in 1 place, and that change will be applied then to anything in that class. To summarize, we've been looking at HTML and using it to organize the structure of the content, but now we're starting to see how we can affect the appearance of the content. We can use the style attribute to specify, for instance, the color, the background color, the size, the type of font of any text within an element. And we can use the class to apply styling to many elements in our HTML page. One of the attributes is style. Style lets us specifically say we want to use this particular font size, color, background color, etc. We can also use the class attribute. The class attribute lets us put elements into a class and then apply styling to all the elements in that class. Here's another example of plain HTML. It's some memorable quotes from movies. Most of the appearance is just the default appearance as decided by the Google Chrome browser. Maybe there's some things that are specifically we've decided on the appearance. For instance, we've said this is the header, so we know it will be bold and a little bit bigger. Here's a link to another page. It's blue and underscored or underlined. We'll see links later. Previously, we saw how to make text italics or italicized, but other than that, everything is just the default appearance. Here's what we could refer to as stylish or stylized HTML. Here we're able to specify different font sizes. Things are bold, things are indented differently. And we're going to see how we can accomplish something like this using what's known as CSS. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is a formal language for specifying the appearance of HTML elements. And CSS has a standard specification defined by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. Why do we have CSS? Well, keep in mind that HTML, in theory, specifies the structure of the content, what information there is, how do things relate to each other, but not so much the appearance of the content. CSS is another language that allows us to specify the appearance of the elements in the HTML page. So how does CSS work? In a previous lesson, we looked at HTTP, and we said that in HTTP, what comes back in an HTTP response is HTML. When the web browser gets the HTML, it starts to try to render all of the elements, but it also looks for the CSS. Now, the CSS, cascading style sheets, can be in the HTML page, or they can be in a separate page, a separate file. If it's in a separate file, the web browser will make another HTTP request to get that separate file, that CSS file, and then we'll get that in the HTTP response. When the browser has downloaded or received all of the HTML and CSS that it needs, now it's ready to start rendering the page. For every element that's in the HTML, the browser will see if there is some CSS to apply to it, different fonts, colors, etc. If there's no specific CSS for that element, then it will just use the default. In theory, we would only have one CSS styling applicable to every element. If there are more than one different types of stylings, for instance, a particular element is in multiple classes or it's in a specific class, but we also decide to style it some other way for some other reason, there are various rules on how those would get resolved. But for our purposes, we'll just say that every HTML element in our page will only have one styling applied. There are three ways that we can use CSS in our HTML pages. Two of them we've already seen without knowing that it was CSS. The first one is what we'll call inline, which is within the element, within the HTML tag, we'll specify the style as an attribute. The second one, which we saw at the end of the previous lesson, is what we can call internal. We have a style element in the head of the HTML, and we can apply different stylings to different classes. And then third, as I mentioned, we can have an external CSS file that is linked from our HTML page, and it would be downloaded separately as a separate HTTP request and response, and then applied to our page. Let's review the first way, which is the inline CSS as a style attribute. When we're doing inline CSS, within the element tag, or within the tag for the element, we specify the style attribute with the styling that we want to apply. In this particular case, we're saying that for this particular element, for this particular tag, we want it to appear red. So in that case, we would see it still H1, still a little bit bigger font, still bold, but in this case red instead of the default, which is black. Let's quickly talk about what is good and bad about inline CSS. Clearly, it's very easy to use if it's only want to do something once. There's just this one specific HTML tag that I want to be red, for instance. It's very easy to do that. However, we saw at the end of the last lesson, if I have a lot of tags that I want to apply this styling to, it's not so good for that. And one problem also is that we're mixing together the HTML and the CSS all in one place. Not even just in one file, but in one place in that one element. We're specifying the structure, but we're also specifying the appearance, and maybe those should be separated. Now, the second way of getting CSS into our HTML pages is what we can call internal CSS, using the style tag. As we saw at the end of the last lesson, we can put the style tag in the header of the HTML, and then we can specify the different appearance of different elements in our HTML page. For instance, in this case, within the head of our HTML, we have the style tag, or style elements, and we're going to say that anything that's H1, anything that's a level 1 header, will be red and will be capitalized. We'll capitalize the first letter of each word. Now, in the bottom of our HTML page, within the body, anytime there's an H1 tag, it's going to apply this CSS, this rule, to any H1, and so this will, as before, appear red. Note that in this case, it would apply this formatting, red, and transforming the first letter of each word to be capital, to every H1, every level 1 header in our web page, and not just this one particular one. It's worth reviewing at this point the CSS syntax. At the start of the lesson, I pointed out that CSS is a language, and CSS has to follow this specific structure. The first thing is known as the selector. The selector specifies to what sorts of elements do we want to apply this formatting. After the selector, we have the curly braces, and within the curly braces, we have property value pairs. The property is the type of appearance, and the value is the specific value, the specific thing. They're end with semicolons, and we can have many of them within the same selector. So using The style tag, style elements, the internal CSS, allows us to separate the content, which is in the body of the HTML page, from the appearance, which is in the head of the HTML page. It's certainly easy to use to apply some styling to all the elements in the page. It's perhaps only good if there's only certain stylings that we want to apply. The disadvantage is that if we have lots and lots and lots and lots of styling to apply, that the head of our HTML page might get really, really big compared to the body of the HTML page. And another problem is that we can't use that styling in other HTML pages without copying and pasting it, which is, of course, not desirable. Which leads us to the third approach to including CSS in our HTML pages, which is the external CSS. In this case, we put CSS in a separate file, and then we link it or include it in our HTML page using a tag in the head of the HTML file. So here we have movies.html, and within the head, we have a link element. The link element tells the browser, go get this other file, link to this other file. In particular, it's saying, go get this file, moviestyles.css. What will happen in this case is that the browser, upon seeing this link element, will make another HTTP request for moviestyles.css. We'll get an HTTP response now containing the contents of that file, moviestyles.css, which we see over here as our CSS file, including the selector and the property value pairs. Here we see, as we saw in the previous example, that we're going to apply this styling to all H1 elements. So for instance, over here, we have the H1 elements. And when we render the page, when the browser renders the page, it will apply this styling to all H1 elements, and so the header, in this case again, would be red. So now we've managed to separate the content and presentation, not just from the body and the head, but in completely separate files, an HTML file and a CSS file. And we can, of course, use this CSS file in many different HTML pages. We could also use many CSS files in one HTML page if we had different stylings in the different files. Of course, when we start to create more files, there's more files to work with, more files to keep track of, but generally this advantages of separating the content, the HTML, and the presentation, the CSS, outweighs these disadvantages. In CSS, remember I said that we have the selectors and then the property value pairs. There are three types of selectors. One is the element selector, as we saw in the previous example. In the element selector, the selector is the HTML tag, or the HTML element. It says apply this styling, in this case red, to all H1 elements in the page. Now, one that we saw at the end of the last lesson was the class selector. The class selector always starts with the period to indicate the name of the class, and then the name of the class. If we had a class called address, and then we had HTML elements that were in that class, using the class attribute, then it would apply this styling to every HTML element that's in that class. And last, we haven't seen an example like this yet, but when we have an ID that's starting with the hashtag or the pound sign, that applies the styling to one specific, distinct, unique element in the HTML page. It bears repeating that the ID has to be unique or distinct within the HTML page. We can only have one element with that particular ID, and this will apply the styling to that element. To summarize, we've started to look at cascading style sheets, a way of affecting the appearance of our HTML elements, perhaps in a separate file that's linked or included from our HTML file. We're going to be seeing CSS a lot in subsequent lessons in this part of the course, and especially in the next couple of weeks of the course, where we're going to dynamically change the appearance of the HTML elements using CSS. In the previous lessons, we've been looking at how to affect the appearance of HTML elements using CSS. In this lesson, we'll go back to plain HTML and talk about some of the other tags that are available to us, starting with lists. In HTML, we can create lists of elements or of items that are ordered or unordered. In an ordered list, we use the OL tag for ordered list. An ordered list, when the browser renders it, it will put, in this case, numbers in front of each list element or list item. We indicate that it's an ordered list using the OL tag, and then each item in the list is surrounded with li and the not li or closing li tag. In an unordered list, there are no numbers in front of each element, just some sort of icon, for instance, in this case, a bullet. The unordered list uses the ul tag, but again, each element in the list has the li and close li tag. In an unordered list, we can use the style attribute to affect the appearance of the type of bullet that's used in front of each item. For instance, here I have ul for unordered list, and then I have the style attribute specifying that the list style type is a circle. Now, rather than the filled-in bullets, the black bullets, this will just be the empty circle. And there are different types of list styles that we can use. There's the disk, which is the default one, the filled-in bullet, the circle, which is the empty circle, a square, or we can just have none at all. In the same way that we can apply style attributes to an unordered list, we can also apply style attributes to an ordered list. Here we use the type attribute, and we specify the type of number or letter that will appear in front of each list item. By default, it will use numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here, by using type equals A, what we'll get is A, B, C, D, etc. in front of each item in the list. And there are a variety of different types that we can use in an unordered list: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, Roman numerals, etc. We can, of course, have a list within a list. We can have, in this case, an ordered list within an unordered list. In this case, we'll have an unordered list on the outside. We'll specify the list style type to be circle. And then on the inside, we'll have an ordered list using A, B, C, D in front of each element, and it would appear like this. The next thing I want to look at is forms. Forms are an important part of any HTML page, especially when we're trying to get information from the user. We're going to use a form element or a form tag in our HTML page and put all the form items within those tags. Each item or input has a different type, and we're going to look at the different types of types within the next few slides here. We can use the type attribute for each input to indicate what type of input it is, and that will let us do some checking later on when we want to make sure, for instance, that a value is legal. So going back to our example here, let's start with these at the top. These are the traditional inputs where the user needs to type something. The first one, that's full name, is the text type. That's just any sort of input text that will appear as a single input text field in the browser. Following that, we can have the email type, which will expect to have a valid email address. We can have the password type, which will, instead of showing in the browser what they're actually typing, will show some kind of bullet or asterisk to hide what they're typing. And last, we can have a date input type, which allows us to, for instance, specify the format of the date, in this case month, day, year, or we can use other formats as well. Now if we go back to our form, we see the next form element or input is this slider. In HTML, we call this a range input, or the range type. This allows the user to slide back and forth and choose different values. And here we're specifying that the minimum value is 1950, the maximum value is 2020. Next, we have an often confused, or two often confused types, which are radio buttons and checkboxes. These ones here indicated in the slide are radio buttons. The radio button appears as a circle that we can click, but a radio button means that we can only choose one out of some group. So these are type radio, but these three options all have the same name. This means that they're grouped together, and the user can only choose one of these three. If they chose one and then clicked on another, then it would unselect the first one that they chose. Each element or each radio button has a different value that we can use later on when we want to see what they selected, but they can only choose one of these three. Below that are checkboxes. Checkboxes are similar, but we can choose more than one. So here the type is checkbox. They all have the same name, which indicates that they all go together, but they have different values, of course, but we can choose more than one. Here we see the color picker, or the color chooser. The input type is color, and when we click that button, what we would see is the color chooser. Different browsers show the color chooser or color picker differently. Here's what it looks like in Google Chrome. When we want the user to be able to upload a file, we have the input type equals file, and they can click the button. For instance, it reads choose file. They'll choose a local file, and then the no file chosen will automatically be changed to the file name when they indicate the file to upload. Last, we have buttons. We're going to be using buttons a lot, especially in the second part of this course when we're doing JavaScript. Here we see two different types of buttons. The first one is the submit button. When we say type equals submit, that means when the user clicks it to take the action of the form. The action of the form, for instance, might be choosing a new page or loading a new page. It might be running some code. We'll see examples of that later. Here we have the reset type. A reset is a button that will clear all of the fields, set them back to their defaults when the user clicks it. There are lots of other input types that we didn't see in this lesson. The most common ones are the type equals text, where the user can type something, and buttons, as we'll see later on. To summarize, in this lesson, we looked at HTML lists, which allow us to organize information in an unordered list or an ordered list. And we looked at forms, which allow us to get information from the user. Here's an example of one called Links. Links was a text-based web browser. You could, of course, click on links or follow links, choose a link using a cursor, but there were no images. Later on, and certainly now, web browsers allow us to see images. For instance, here's a photo of a woman cycling. How do we get images into our HTML pages? We do that using the image or IMG tag. The IMG tag tells the web browser to show an image in that particular spot. Now, the image is not really in the HTML page. Remember, HTML is just plain text. Rather, it's a link. It tells the browser to go get that image, and we'll talk about where it gets it in a little bit. The image has two required attributes. One is the source, or SRC. That's the location of the image. And the other is alt, or ALT. That's the alternative, or alternate, I should say, text. That's what should appear as the image description, for instance, if the image could not be loaded. It's also used, for instance, for screen readers, which are going to read the text. We can also specify the height and width of the image, and we can specify the title of the image, which is the text that will appear when the user hovers over it with the mouse. At the bottom, here's an example of how we would have an image in our HTML page. We'd open up with the image tag. We'd specify the source, the name of the image. And an alt, what we call the alt text, the alternate text, is a description of the image that would be shown in the page if for some reason the image could not be loaded. Now, I mentioned we have to specify the location of the image. And there are two ways of specifying the location of the image. One is the absolute path, and the other is the relative path. The absolute path is a URL that could be accessed on its own. It is the full path. It is its distinct, unique address on the World Wide Web. And in this case, we're using the absolute path by specifying the entire URL, including the protocol, HTTP, etc., etc. However, if the image that we want to display in the HTML page is somewhere, for instance, near the HTML page, like on the same computer, we can use what's known as the relative path. Here, for instance, we see that we have some file structure. We have our index.html page, and maybe there are two of these images, one in the same folder or directory, another in a subfolder or subdirectory. We can, instead of using the absolute path, including HTTP, etc., we can just say that it's the same directory but a different file using the relative path. We could also say it's relative to the location of this HTML page. In this case, it's in the photos subdirectory or subfolder, and then this is the name of the file. Now, core or key to the entire idea of the World Wide Web is that from one page you can link or go or traverse or surf. I guess no one says surf anymore. You can surf to another page. We do that using the A tag or anchor tag. Now, the A tag, the anchor tag, has a lot of uses in an HTML page, but the most common one is when we're linking to another page or another resource on the web. The A tag has an href attribute, which is the location to which we should jump or navigate when the link is clicked. We can also have the target, which says whether we should open a new window or a new tab, for instance, when the user clicks that link. When we're following a link and specifying it using the A tag, we can use an absolute path or a relative path. And then we specify in the HTML the link, or in some cases the image, that needs to be clicked in order to follow that link. In this case, we start with the A tag or the anchor tag. Then we specify the href, the location to which we should navigate if the user clicks on this link. We have the target, in this case meaning just show the content in this web browser itself. Here is the text that, as you've seen in many web browsers, I'm sure, is the clickable link. And then we end the HTML element using the not A or the /A tag. Sometimes we can use an A tag or an A element, an anchor element, to link not just to another web page, but somewhere specifically within that web page or even specifically within the page itself. And we call those using bookmarks. We can do that using the ID attribute for any element in the HTML page. For instance, let's say I have some level 3 header, and I want the user to be able to click a link that scrolls the web page to that particular part of the page rather than starting at the top of the page. I can specify its ID, in this case health, and then I create links that will go to that part of the page. If it's within the same page, I can have href equals pound or hashtag health, and this is a link. When the user clicks on this link, it will scroll to that part of the page. If I want to have a bookmark to a spot in a different page, I can have the name of that page, then hash mark or pound, and then the name of the ID of the element to which to scroll when we open that page. Last, we'll look at tables. In the previous lesson, we talked about lists. Lists were a way of organizing information. Tables give us even more structure. We can use the table tag to say this is the start and end of our table. In this case, we're specifying the border, which is the width of the border between elements in the table. A table consists of rows. Each row of the table starts and ends with the tr tag for table row. There are two different types of rows. One row, which we can call the header, uses the th tag for table header to indicate the content that goes into that row. It doesn't have to be the first row of the table, though that would usually make the most sense. Here we see that the browser, by default, is rendering it in bold, indicating that's the header of the table. The td tag is the table data. That's just for a regular table cell, a regular row within our table. Here we see the text rendered just as normal text. Just like every other HTML element, the table has attributes that we can use to affect its appearance. We saw border in the previous example. That's the border that will appear around the table. We can specify for the border the width in pixels. We can specify whether it's a solid or dotted line border. We can specify the color, etc. The padding is the space between the cell content and the borders. So if we have some text and we have a lot of padding, then the borders will move farther and farther away from that text. We can specify the alignment of the text within any cell or an entire row. And then the border spacing is affected by this border spacing property, which is the space between the different cells. Now, in that previous example, we had a 3x3 grid or table, but sometimes we want a cell to span multiple rows or multiple columns. We can use the row span attribute to say that this particular cell should go across, for instance, in this case, 2 rows. So we see here that it starts on one row, but then would go down to the next. Well, if there's row span, then there must be column span or col span. This would say to let this table data cell go across multiple columns. To summarize, we've seen the last 3 HTML tags that we're going to look at in this course. We have the image tag for including images in our HTML pages. We have the A or anchor tag for creating links, and the table tag for further organizing our data. But it's important to remember, as a professional software developer, that the users of the web page, the people who are viewing your web page, may be doing so on different types of devices. Sometime in late 2016, the usage on the mobile and handheld and tablet devices started to exceed usage from desktop devices, laptops, PCs, etc. This means that not only are people looking at your web pages on smaller devices, but of course on a variety of different types of devices, which raises challenges when it comes to designing the page. Here we see perhaps a traditional web design. At the top we have what they call a carousel of data. Here's some charts at the bottom here. And if we have a web page that looks like this, and we look at it on a phone or a tablet, by default the browser we'll try, on the mobile device, we'll try to crush everything into the little space that it has, which can warp or affect the appearance of things. For instance, now these charts seem to be crushed together. What we want is something known as responsive web design. In responsive web design, the web page realizes that the browser on which it's being viewed might be smaller or bigger, and fills in the space accordingly. So responsive web design is an approach to designing the web pages or creating the web pages that we think about the different types of devices and how the page would look when rendered in different types of browsers. How do we achieve RWD, or responsive web design? Well, we could try to write different CSS for different types of browsers. In CSS, we can detect the browser type, and then we could say on certain browsers and certain devices, we'd have different spacing, different sizes, but that can certainly be lots and lots and lots and lots of CSS. And every time a new device or a new size device comes out, we'd have to go back and modify our CSS. What we want instead is automatic responsive web design, to use tools that do this automatically for us. And one such tool is known as Bootstrap. Bootstrap is an open source front-end development framework that's produced and maintained by Twitter, and it lets us create responsive web pages and applications just by using CSS. Key to understanding how to use Bootstrap is understanding what they call the grid system. In Bootstrap, all elements in the page are arranged into a grid, and depending on the size of the web browser or the size of the device, it will rearrange those grid elements. So here's a quick way of starting to use Bootstrap. We begin with a basic HTML page, just like any other HTML page that we would write. To include Bootstrap in our project, we would include these following tags in the head section of our HTML page. We would specify the CSS style sheet that we're going to use, and then we would specify these two JavaScript libraries. We'll, of course, look at JavaScript later in this course, but for now, we'll just use the JavaScript that Bootstrap makes available to us on the web. In this particular slide, I'm showing the most recent versions of Bootstrap, but you should go to the getbootstrap.com website in order to get what's more updated. Next, in the head section of our HTML page, we specify this meta tag named viewport. And all this does is tell the web browser to figure out the width of the device or the browser, and then use that when figuring out how to arrange the elements in the Bootstrap grid. Last, we can apply Bootstrap formatting to all the elements in our HTML by using a div in the container class. Container is a class in the Bootstrap CSS that has the different formatting rules, and we would create a div and put our content into that div. That allows Bootstrap to figure out how to change the appearance of the content in our page. If we create the default Bootstrap Hello World page, it would look something like this. And if we were to resize it, it would resize accordingly. In the Bootstrap grid system, all the content is organized into rows, which of course are just horizontal groups of columns. And Bootstrap will figure out how to arrange those depending on the device and the size of the window. In this example, we're going to see the same content, more or less, rendered with Bootstrap and without Bootstrap. At the top of my HTML here, I am going to use Bootstrap. I'll create a div that's in the container class. Remember, if you're going to use Bootstrap, you have to have a div in the class container and put your content into there. Within that container, I will create a single row. Now, this isn't the same as a row in a table, but rather a row in the Bootstrap grid system. Within the row, I will have more divs, which are in different classes depending on how much of that row I want them to take up. We can think of the row as having a width of 12. And in this case, I'm saying that each column within the row takes up 4, that's what the 4 here specifies, 4 of the 12. But I can perhaps take half or more than half, and so on, by specifying different column widths. Now at the bottom of my page, I have a traditional table that we saw in a previous lesson. The table will not automatically resize, but as we saw at the beginning of this lesson, when we make the web browser smaller, the content will get crushed together. So here's how that HTML page looks when rendered in Google Chrome, more or less full screen. So we can see they look very similar. This is one row of the Bootstrap grid system. And this, of course, is just one row of our traditional HTML table. But when I start to move the browser or make the browser smaller, you can see what happened now is that Bootstrap figured out that this content, it can't fit all of the content in that one row. So rather than trying to have it all in one row, it'll start putting things underneath each other. However, my HTML table is going to keep getting smaller and smaller as I make the window smaller. Now I've made the window so small that the Bootstrap content appears here in the same way, now stacked on top of each other. But now the HTML in the table is starting to use multiple rows because I'm making the cells so small. If I want to see what my HTML page looks like on different devices, I can use tools, for instance, in Google Chrome, to render it on different devices and see how it would respond to different device sizes. Here's the same page that we saw in the previous example. If I right-click or get the context menu, I can then go to Inspect in Google Chrome, and that'll open a window like this, which shows me the HTML and the rendered HTML at the same time. By default, it's showing me my responsive web page, the regular Google Chrome browser. But here I can change to, for instance, iPhone 5, and Google Chrome will show me what it looks like on iPhone 5. Now, of course, it's just figuring out the dimensions of the iPhone 5 browser, but we can see in this case that my Bootstrap content does get stacked on iPhone 5, but my table is getting crushed here. If I want to choose a different device, I can, for instance, choose iPad, and then I can see what happens when I rotate the iPad using the Rotate button, and now I can see what it would look like in that particular browser. We're not going to do too much more with Bootstrap in this lesson. I do recommend, if you're interested in this, that you look at the Bootstrap website, and probably through looking at the Bootstrap website, especially their examples, you'll see lots of things that you would like to try or include in your HTML pages as well. Fortunately, every browser allows you to inspect or see the HTML source, and you can get an idea of how the elements in the Bootstrap examples are put there. For instance, here on the examples page for Bootstrap, I see the different buttons. And maybe in my web page, I want this sort of button, this big blue button with a gray border around it. I can right-click or get the context menu. I can choose Inspect, and that will open up in Google Chrome, the Inspect window. And I can see that it's highlighted here, and here, circle it. It tells me that this element that I like is a button. It's in type button, and it's in these three Bootstrap classes, the BTN for button, BTN large for a large button, and BTN primary for what they call the primary button, which is the blue. So I can use those classes in my HTML page to get a button that looks exactly the same as that one. That's it for week 1 of this course. We started off by looking at HTTP, the protocol that's used on the World Wide Web for transferring data. We saw HTML for allowing us to specify the structure of our web content, and CSS for allowing us to specify its appearance. In this lesson, we looked at responsive web design using libraries, for instance, Bootstrap, to automatically resize our page and make it look nice on different types of devices.